Hello. I'm going to read a poem by Richard Wilbur, Hamlen, Brook, from his new poems of 1987. I will then share some reflections on the poem and some thoughts about what it might tell us about the poetic call to new life. Hamlen, Brook. At the alder darkened brink, where the stream slows to a lucid jet, I lean to the water, dinting its top with sweat, and see, before I can drink, a startled inchling trout of spotted near transparency, trawling a shadow solider than he. He swerves now, darting out, to where in a flicked slew of sparks and glittering silt, he weaves through streambed rocks, disturbing foundered leaves, and butts them out of view, beneath a sliding glass crazed by the skimming of a brace of burnished dragonflies across his face, in which deep cloudlets pass, and a white precipice of mirrored birch trees plunges down toward where the azures of the zenith drown. How shall I drink all this? Joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy. This is in some respects an old-fashioned poem. It's certainly not a poem responsive to the modernist dictum, make it new. If there is something new here, it's the newness of a fresh cup of water from an ancient spring. But I'd like to suggest that when we encounter a poem or any other artwork, we shouldn't primarily ask, is it new, or what is new about it? We should ask instead, is it alive, or what is vital and life-giving about it? And I think we may look for two aspects of this living or life-giving quality. Firstly, we can ask, is poetry alive in it? And secondly, does it bring the world to life? And I think this poem answers both questions in the affirmative. To my mind, Wilbur restores the metrical tradition to a remarkable freshness. His handling of form and metre, which I think is both virtuosic but self-professedly irreverent, proves the craft to be anything but exhausted. In that sense, poetry is alive and well in and through the poem. And further, while there is nothing new, of course, about the metre as such, it is to metre and rhyme that the poem owes much of its integrity and energy as a poem. The way the rhythm ripples over the supple iambic beats, the undulations of tri, tetra, and pentameter lines, giving the poem movement and variation as well as regularity, and the enjambed lines and stanzas more than mimicking the meandering brook, the fluency and translucence of the language. All these poetic properties and qualities allow us to glimpse a protean and prolific world beneath and between the lines of the poem. And yes, I think the poem does bring the world to life, and returns us to the world with new perceptions and a new thirst. Wilbur himself has observed that the poem is old-fashioned in the way that it ends with a kind of moral. And he's able to get away with this, I think, with telling us things, as it were, because he also always shows us, because the poem does what it preaches, embodies what it reveals. The long sentence at the heart of the poem is quite difficult to read, and we see the syntax kind of struggling to keep up with the flowing phenomena. A multi-layered vision of reality, teasingly tugging both sense and language to the very cusp of their capacities for registering and representing the world. The sentence ends, crucially, with the world turned on its head, fully immersed in the water, as it were, and transformed in the process. And for those of us interested in the links between poetry and theology, the poem is irresistibly suggestive here. The imagery is baptismal, and in the next breath, arguably, Eucharistic. At the end of that long, breathless sentence, the speaker is caught in wonder. The verse is halted in wonder. How shall I drink all this? He comes to drink and gets more than he knowingly thirsted for. He comes face to face with a world that offers nourishment beyond our natural capacity for consumption and comprehension. A different kind of thirst is both kindled and rewarded here. Indeed, the thirst itself becomes a gift, the insatiability itself more a blessing than a burden, more abundance than lack. I think the poem does for us what the brook does for the speaker. It offers us enchantment and joy, relief and replenishment. It kindles in us also a thirst for more of what the poem offers, more of that elusive plenitude which the poem partakes of but does not entirely possess, which we may drink of but not exhaust. Again, for those of us with such leanings, the final line, I think, is a masterstroke of apatheticism. Nothing can satisfy. The poem allows us, arguably, to read nothing as only God, or at least to read it as no finite thing. So far from being a nihilist poem, affirming nothing, the poem, like much of Wilbur's work, affirms the goodness of creation itself and the meaningfulness of our imaginative being in the world. Wilbur has said in interview that the world is fundamentally a great wonder and a great order. Like many of Wilbur's poems, I think Hamlen Brook is emblematic of such a view and iconic of such a world. If we ask, where is this new life that we are called to? Wilbur's poems would respond quite simply, right here. Again and again, Wilbur urges us towards the actual and incarnate. We see in poems like this, and in poems with such telling titles as Love Calls Us to the Things of This World, and A World Without Objects is a Sensible Emptiness. Striking titles that almost makes arguments in their own right. The latter of these urges us to turn from the deserts of metaphysical or mystic abstraction back to the homely, creaturely, and inhabited world, to what it names the spirit's right oasis, light incarnate. And here I'd like to make another theological observation. There appears to be no distinction between nature and grace in Wilbur's poetry. The natural, when seen aright, taken up in a poetic mode, is shown to be already graced. The precise theological implications of this, and whether poetry in this way challenges or affirms particular doctrinal claims, is something to discuss further another time. But much of the power of Wilbur's poetry resides in its ability even to suggest this, to give us reality in this way. In one of his more complex and compelling poems, Lying, the poet claims that we invent nothing, merely bearing witness to what each morning brings again to light. And of course, there is nothing merely about it. This is a poem in praise of the oneness of the world, the cognate splendor, as Wilbur calls it, out of which all things came to take their scattering names. It is also a poem showing how mind and matter are indissolubly linked. Though the world is there before us, to be seen or not, our seeing of it is somehow deeply implicated in what it is. Indeed, it seems that it may take a poetic eye, to grant a view of things as they are. The poem strikingly remarks how it is odd that a thing is most itself when likened, suggesting that it takes metaphor, perhaps even rhyme and meter, to represent reality, and for reality to come to full articulation. In conclusion, then, we may learn from Wilbur, as we may learn from Blake and others, that to an insatiable imaginative engagement with the world is truly inexhaustible. At the same time, Wilbur gives us grounds to consider precisely how poetry may adequately represent, may be adequate to, or microcosmic of, such a reality, and to what extent the old-fashioned qualities of meter and rhyme are essential to the task. I think Wilbur's is a body of poetry that does call us to, and does reward us with, new life. For me, he's a relatively recent discovery, but he's someone who's inspired the writing of more poetry, which I think is precisely what poetry should do. And I hope his work may also come to influence the writing and research of some of you. Thank you.